Hello, I'm Chris Abbass. Welcome to the Hiring on All Cylinders podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by one of my favorite TA leaders, Sam Perlman. Sam has spent years working with some of the best technology companies in Silicon Valley, the likes of Airbnb, Fastly, and now OneSignal, where she's head of talent. In this episode, we talk about the difference between being a manager and a head of talent, how to set yourself up for success in a new role, and I'm really looking forward to sharing this episode with you. I hope you enjoy. Hello, Sam. How are you?
Hello. Doing well. How are you doing?
Good. Well, first of all, congratulations on a semi-new role. I guess that could be a really good place to jump in. It'd be really great to get an overview of your role and a bit about the company you're currently working at.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going on almost 4 months now, which is crazy. It absolutely flew by. So OneSignal is a leading customer engagement platform. Specifically, we're an omni-channel solution, which basically means we allow companies to, send personalized messages, set up customized customer journeys, and we do that all through a bunch of different avenues. So we do that through specifically push notifications, both mobile and web, through in-app messages, through SMS, and through email. So just really allowing businesses to engage with their customers and retain them. So right now, 1 in 7 apps launches using OneSignal right now, which is kind of crazy when you think about that. So we're used by over a million companies right now to send over 10 billion messages a day, which is huge. That's good scale for anyone, but especially considering I think we just hit 140 people. So pretty impressive given that. And I was just really excited to join that small and impressive team. And we just raised our Series C. So it's exciting times over here. So funnily enough, I had an offer from them 3 years ago, but I was actually just coming off of my own startup at the time and wasn't sure if it was necessarily the right choice for me at the time to jump into another small startup. I wound up deciding that it was time for me to go to a larger company at that time, and I felt awful because I thought this company was really going places and I really loved the people. And they reached out 3 years later and here I am. Honestly, I think I'm more useful to them now, given that. Just having seen a company through IPO, having that additional experience under my belt really puts me in a better position to help get them to that next stage. So I think it's a win-win. Also really good reminder that sometimes a no from a candidate is not a no, it's just a not right now. So always check in with your candidates because things in their life might change and it could be the right fit later on. So always contact your candidates who get away. Definitely worth it.
It came full circle. That's really cool. And you're in the head of talent role. Talk to me a little bit about the responsibilities of that role, and I guess what really excited you when taking on the position. Was it you're coming in, they're raising funding, and you're here to scale from X to Y, or what was the big sell and the thing that really excited you coming into that role?
It's both it's honestly probably coming into any leadership role a little too. You're both coming in to be the pit crew to simultaneously keep it running at full speed and help them go faster, but also rebuild the foundation as they're doing that. So, and particularly from talking to this team, I knew the passion, the energy was there. They were thinking about things correctly. It was just a matter of having the right person in the role to help them get there, and what that was going to look like. And that's the most exciting thing to me, right? I want to be rebuilding that foundation while still going a million miles an hour. So to be able to come do that with a team that you're really excited about, that was a really unique opportunity.
Cool. And I know there's a lot of people that are listening or watching that have aspirations to be a head of talent, or maybe even starting a head of talent more shortly. How are you thinking about when you join OneSignal? There's probably so much to do. The company's going at 1 million miles an hour, as you said. How do you make sure you really set yourself up for success and you look at the business from kind of that blank slate? What was your process? How did you go about doing that?
Step 1, be a sponge. Number 1, ask as many questions as possible, soak in all the answers before you start cleaning things up, which for me as an action biased person who typically that doer, that fixer, that's the hardest part. I have to tell myself slow down, listen, evaluate from there. So step one was set up a million one-on-ones, like first with my team, find out their pain points, find out what's working well, what they want to keep doing, start doing, stop doing. Also meeting with managers, with leadership level execs, directors, ICs, everyone. Find out from each person's perspective, like what's working really well and what are the areas for opportunity and how can recruiting better partner with them. And a lot of that's kind of, you've probably heard like Toyota's 5 whys, like, go down the list, like think deeper, but you also want to think broader and plan ahead, like find out what those pain points are and like how you're going to tackle those. And you're going to wind up with an insanely long list. And then it's about ruthlessly prioritizing that. And of course, pairing what you're hearing from other people with like obviously what you've seen in the space with the data that's available there and general best practices. For me, I like personally setting up a prioritization matrix of what those are. So if you see one of those, it's like urgent and important things. It's like urgent and not important, where the idea that, important is value creation. You're adding value in a certain area, whether that's creating efficiency or improving a process, it's driving revenue, providing a better experience, something like that. And urgent is, it's time bound. It needs to be done in a specific time frame, whether that's like compliance, a regulatory thing, or it's like it poses a risk if you don't get it done. And then it's going about, okay, how do you categorize those things? So kind of in general, you'll see a lot in talent, we want to prioritize, how do we deliver an incredible candidate experience? How do we deliver an amazing hiring manager partnership and set up that incredible relationship? And then you can kind of track, great, so this whole list of things, how do I fit it into those categories? And what needs to be done now versus what's a little more scaling for the future, and kind of break it down into manageable chunks. So I wound up with this huge list on day one and kind of started piecing it into those different quadrants of what that would look like for me. And so even one of those things in like urgent and important becomes, you still need to fill all your roles that quarter. Like those aren't stopping. You still have hiring targets. Looking at our metrics, like we need to decrease time to fill. I want to increase offer accept. So what are the things I need to do in order to accomplish those? Great. Like that's the highest priority. And then piecemealing everything else. Like what are the nice to haves, or where we want to be in 6 months from now? And what's going to involve other departments as well. And then actually one of the biggest things I did too was set up, was like audit and go through all of our tech tools.
And how do you, when you're going in and you're looking at all these different areas, having these conversations and coming up with, this is urgent, this is time bound, do you have the autonomy to kind of decide that, or do you want to decide that on your own, or do you use kind of your manager or other people in the business to kind of run that by and confirm that list and get the agreement on the priorities? How do you go about doing that across the business?
Yep. So I already put together kind of, because I've already spoken to people to kind of understand what their priorities, right? So I'll have that in mind while I'm making that matrix and saying what's most important and so forth. But yeah, I definitely, and one of the reasons I love this company is like one of the values is empowerment and intelligent risk taking. So this is definitely a, bite off as much as you can chew sort of role, which is what I love about it. So there is a degree of, they hire you for your expertise in that area. So I'm definitely going through and mapping out, hey, these are the priorities. And then talking to my boss and talking to other leadership, like, do we agree? Like, are these the right priorities? Is this what you had in mind as well? And, more often than not, they're like, oh yeah, like that sounds great. Or, oh yeah, I didn't think about that should be on the timeline. Or I'm also thinking about, we were switching to another HRIS at the time. So how are the changes I'm going to make going to play into that timing wise? Or I obviously don't want to roll out a big thing if that's going to be the same week as our like company onsite or something. You always want to think about it with an all company lens. How is that going to affect the other pieces of it?
Mm-hmm. That sounds like really complex almost to manage for one person, and all these dependencies and things that could go wrong. Do you have kind of centralized place or a method of managing all that and visualizing it? You mentioned you build this matrix, but do you do that just like on your own in your own kind of sheet somewhere, or do you use something?
Yeah. Honestly, for that's in like Google Drive like presentation. It's literally one of the slides in there. I just have the matrix. I refer to that. And then for me personally, I'm a compulsive note taker. I love the feeling of, crossing something off on my to-do list. I just have Apple Notes on the side of my, on the side of my computer to do that. But the biggest piece is also, I'm actually a huge gem proponent. So being able to set up like dashboards and things in there so I can regularly track like how the team doing, how am I doing towards our more quantitative goals, which is really helpful too.
Yeah. From going through this process at OneSignal, what are some of the most exciting things that you've uncovered as projects to get started with in your first couple of months?
Yeah. Ooh, there's been a lot. So a lot of them were from talking to people and figuring out, like what the pain points were. So some of them, and some of the easier ones to actually do quickly that I thought were going to have a big impact are tools related. So things like, I noticed the team was manually writing in spreadsheets, like who the candidates were and the stage they were at and things like that. Or exec team was reaching out for updates on candidates and didn't necessarily have like the right up-to-date information on our metrics or time to hire and things like that. So realizing, in this case, this is actually something like we already have a tool for this. It's just not being fully utilized for that. So making sure like building out dashboards in Gem was one of the first things I did to make sure that, we all had access to that. The leaders had access to it. The recruiters knew what was going on and could track their own metrics, that they had that. One of the biggest things sitting down with my team, like the first question I want to ask everyone is, do you know what success in your role looks like? Because my definition of what success in their role looks like might not be the expectations they had previously. And you want to make sure, you're on the same page and they know what they're being evaluated against. So rolling out that, like an actual, document that sits in our Drive and in our internal system of what are those tools for success and what do those expectations look like. So it's written, people can refer to it. We're all on the same page. So even rolling out little things like that to make sure that you're aligned to begin with before you jump into the bigger things was huge. And then there's bigger things like our ATS right now. I'm transferring our ATS. So figuring out, what were those gaps that we were missing from our current one? And in this case, we weren't fully utilizing its capabilities. And if I was going to go in and build out a bunch of things from scratch in our current one, and it didn't do some of the longer term things we were looking for, like being able to have different interview plans for different roles and being able to have different triggers for stages, then I might as well switch now if I need to build out the other things from scratch anyway, and this one will help us scale in the long run. So kind of seeing what makes sense to do now versus later.
Yeah. And going from changing ATSs, what was the process? Was that just going to a vendor that you used previously? Did you look at a bunch of different vendors? What was your process of elimination and picking that?
Yeah. In this case, I did go to one I've used previously and kind of its reputation as being like best in class. I know there's a couple, new incumbents lately, which I'm actually pretty excited about, but it's a little harder to go with a newer option if you don't have all the integrations, because that's a huge part too. If you're going with one that's been around for a while, it's going to have the integrations you need, whether that's working with your scheduling tool, your HRIS system, your Gem, other things like that. I want to make sure that I could accommodate all of that. So luckily I knew which one we wanted to go with pretty quickly. And then it becomes a lot of the timing, right? Because switching an ATS is actually, it's not just a like time cost for me, but it's for the company, right? You need to now onboard everyone to a new tool. So you have to plan out what that training is going to look like, what that timeline, when you're officially like exactly your go date and make sure it's all done by then and smooth. It still involves like design and engineering. You also need the careers page up and everything. So you realize it's a really large undertaking that actually involves a lot of people and training up your recruiting team ahead of time. So just making sure that, I'm planning accordingly for that and everyone knows what the time expectation and commitment is from them as well.
Yeah. And I think that, you just talked about how you go about evaluating and, I'm sure everyone senior in the organization can't wait to get all this stuff done. But I can imagine, and I know you hear quite a lot that you have to get, there's some resistance. Maybe people don't like change in the teams that you're working in potentially. I'm not saying your team particularly, but maybe you have to plan, for this. What have you found the best way of coming into a new team that was existing and getting, those people on board and bought in and excited about the future plans? yeah, I think that's a challenge that a lot of people face.
Yeah. I'll say part of the asking a lot of questions up front, I think that helps a lot with that. We've now tapped into what's important to them as well. And I'm thoughtful in making sure that I'm aligning our goals and addressing like those most pressing things that they brought up in those first conversations. Because everyone's already going to have their kind of preconceived notions of this is what's important in the role. This is what I'm really hoping you do first. So making sure that you're aligning that and can come back to that and show them like how you're going to accomplish that, whether that's, the first thing on the list or the fifth, but that's providing context around, okay, well, this is why those first four things like need to be done more urgently or why they're going to help me achieve that fifth one. So it's mindful of, explaining what needs to get done now while also thinking about how am I going to optimize these things here and how am I going to build for longer scale with these things. But you need to get the MVP out the door first. Even if my long-term goal, like one of them is we need to do better branding as a company and things like that. That's still like a longer term one where there's a lot of micro kind of steps that are gonna come first and kind of help lead to that. So I think that's a big one. Just asking questions, making sure it's aligned. Providing context is a huge one. So context around like my decisions and explaining the why. Making sure they know also my kind of decision-making framework, that they know there's no ego behind when anything I'm doing. Like I'm always looking at things from an all-company lens. So I think also aligning, because they're also getting to know you as a person and what your work looks like. So that's part of it. And then like any role, it's about relationship building. So it's both, I found that typically like having those difficult conversations up front and like giving people direct feedback too, those both help build more trust, actually. And also means they're more likely to, give you direct feedback as well. So those are things I make a point of doing and also of asking for direct feedback. And I think that really helps build that relationship and it helps build that trust. And importantly, delivering from the get-go. I think that's huge because also on the other hand, actions speak louder than words. So making sure that you do deliver up front and immediately prove that impact. So I make a point of coming in, immediately making improvements at the same time while I'm simultaneously working on like the larger, longer term projects.
Mm-hmm. And, you mentioned earlier that, there's a lot of project work that needs to be done around how we make improvements and how you make improvements at OneSignal. But then there's the kind of execution of we've got hires to make, right? And how do you balance that? The need to meet the demands of the business in terms of growth and hiring, and then also the team getting involved in project work. Do you have kind of a formula that you use or some kind of way you rationalize that?
Yeah. Step one, the priority is always a hires in terms of the teamwork. So, like that's number one. That comes most importantly. If they have time and interest in project work, like especially for senior level recruiters and beyond, like they also really want to get involved, really want to get involved in project work. I'd love to involve them in it. And then it's simply a matter of, hey, as long as, hires are getting done and so forth, then great, then there's time for project work. And honestly, just coming into a role and that's already kind of changing up some things, haven't yet involved them in project work. That'll be coming this quarter, actually. The first quarter was strictly, okay, let's redo a few things, make sure we're getting all of our hires. We're all comfortable tracking metrics. We all understand what the expectations are. Great. We hit our goals for the quarter. And then going into Q4, like making that list as a team. We actually went through a project where we all sat down and we went through what our team like mission, vision, and value should be. Because now that also helps align everything we do as a team to what those are. That kind of becomes like our North Star and it constantly comes back to, okay, what's important? Are the things we're doing and decisions we're making, are they all kind of in service of our mission and values? Great. It becomes kind of that helpful framework. So we've been focused on that. And moving into this quarter, there'll definitely be more projects around, rolling out candidate one pagers, making sure that candidates have a nice, prep packet going into their onsite of exactly what's expected. There's a lot of our team's particularly very passionate about candidate experience, and there's a lot of kind of bite-sized projects we can do there. So it's a matter of kind of meeting with them, deciding what those are and what the interest level is. And then how do I make sure, they are little like bite-sized projects for each person that can be completed in a certain time frame. But I think that's important too. You don't want to give someone a huge project that's going to like drag on or expect them to manage what those milestones look like, but making sure that I can help them with that and set out, hey, the expectation is this should take however many days or weeks we think this is definable in this time, and it can be the MVP. It doesn't have to be the perfect, beautiful version. It can be the minimum viable product that we think this is a great step. Okay, the next step 2 weeks from then is great. Let's get to this stage. So just really helping that along, and I think it's really useful too, because then you're learning valuable like project management skills.
Absolutely, yeah. And so once you've done all this, and I think sometimes, talent leaders especially, you can get your head down, you do all this work and add a lot of value, but the business doesn't necessarily see it because it's just, hires are being made and they're like, oh, they're just magically coming into the business and this is all working really well, right? And how do you go about, showing the success of your team and I guess your own work against those objectives to your leadership? Like, what's the process you use that?
Yeah. Constant transparency, both in the one-on-ones with my boss, but also in we have company all hands and things like that where we track OKRs. Like there's certain OKRs I'm responsible for. Like this quarter, it's get greenhouse up and running and make sure we deliver all of our hires. There's a little more kind of the company-facing end goal ones, and then on the back end, sort of all the little things that go into that I'm are listed out kind of in the matrix, and I make sure. Well, when I say the matrix, it sounds like something different. In my prioritization matrix, kind of going through these are all the steps behind the scenes and making sure they understand what goes into that and whose involvement is involved. And yeah, I mean, luckily have been really lucky. They seem really on board. They seem really appreciative. They understand the work that goes into it, and so far I've been really, really happy with the end result. I'm also really lucky. I have a great team, so I feel really, really fortunate.
Awesome. And I guess, you're in this role now, you come from a bigger organization where you had a bigger team around you, and now you're kind of the head of talent leading the function. Where do you turn to for, I guess, development, learning, inspiration, even going through this process now, joining this new company, how have you drawn inspiration? Where have you drawn it from?
Yeah. Lots of audiobooks. But actually, no. So right now I'm listening to Atomic Habits, and there's actually a great line. I'm probably going to butcher it, but something to the effect of, we don't rise to the level of our goal, we fall to the level of our systems, which is a great reminder. I think that comes back to a few of the questions you asked, and it's very much about your decision-making framework and how you set things up, because that's going to be the most sustainable and repeatable. And if we only focus on the goal, then that's a little harder to constantly replicate, or if you don't happen to meet the goal that time. So I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I try to actually read some tree books too, but there's not always time. Audiobooks are a lot easier if I'm in the car or doing tasks around the house. Honestly, reading a lot of articles on LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn's kind of stepped up its game in terms of the material and content that tends to be on there a lot, and just having an extended network. They tend to post really interesting things. And honestly, just my network, reaching out to people regularly. I think having a really good network in this industry is key. It's we're a pretty small industry all in, actually. So even one of the tools I just signed up for was I was talking to a friend in the industry, and of course it turns to shop talk. And I was like, hey, I really want to find something that solves for interviewer load balancing and also automates how to do interviewer training. It would automate the tracking of interviewer shadowing and reverse shadowing. The tool's got to be out there, right? Before I do research on my own, have you heard of one? It's oh yeah, go check out this one. Oh, that was much easier. So just, relying on talk to people in your network. Chances are, they've come across the same problems. That, the problem you're currently having is probably not unique to you. They've probably been there, and definitely try and crowdsource the answers. They're probably out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've worked at several different tech companies now, for a good amount of time. You've seen lots of trends, you've seen lots of different market dynamics. What do you think the trends are going to be in kind of recruiting for high growth, businesses? And are you thinking about maybe doing anything innovative in the team, or anything that, I'm just interested in your thought process, because you've worked at some great companies, and I think you're always on the kind of forefront of what's happening in kind of tech recruiting. So, how do you think about that?
Yeah. I think it's a huge focus on remote work, which hugely supportive of. I think that's an incredible push in the right direction. I think it's going to be a matter of balancing what that looks like for also employee happiness, like talking to a number of friends at different companies. Does that look like a, all company-wide event twice a year? Does that look like still team events every quarter so you still have that camaraderie and that level of discourse? Is that putting, Zoom virtual lunches on the calendar like once a week? I don't think we've solved it yet or we found the exact solution. I think we've, generally come to agreement of people can still be really successful and high performers working remotely. But within that, like, what are the nuances? What is that balance of keeping people like productive, but still like happy and connected to the company? To what degree do you need to be on site, or do you just need those kind of, relaxed virtual meetings that kind of solve for that water cooler talk that you miss? So I think it'll be interesting to see how that shapes out. Like, I've talked to some companies that are doing, having certain departments come into the office on certain days. Because, right, if everyone's not in the office, that defeats the point of you coming in. Because you're probably coming in just for the camaraderie and the brainstorming and the social aspect, and less the actual productive. You're actually, if anything, from an actual output perspective, probably going to be less productive that day. But it's more the overall connection to the company and other aspects that you're getting out of it. So what does that look like? Or do you mandate that certain roles need to be in the office, particularly like sales teams really thrive off of like camaraderie and that, especially more junior like BDR and SDR roles. Like, are they more productive when they're in the office and they're together and you have that energy playing off of one another in a sales call? So I think we're going to see interesting trends in what that looks like for different departments and kind of different roles over time, like how remote affects that. I think we've seen definitely a shift from the culture interview to a focus more on like values interviews and how you tie that back to the company values. That's actually one thing like we're focused on right now as a company too. How do we make sure it's not a like culture interview per se, but we really want to make sure these people embody our values. Like that's the goal, that your candidates are going to value the same things. So focusing on that. I think we're seeing a lot of really incredible tools, which is amazing. I think we've come a really long way from, God, I used to have, Post-it notes up on a whiteboard of the candidates like moving through the process before like Trello or Gem or anything was around. And used to use Bullhorn was my ATS and like regular spreadsheets for things. So I think we're seeing really amazing development in terms of tools right now, and just honestly just a general shift over time from when I started of, recruiting was a support function. That's what it was. Into now like recruiting, I think there's been realization and a general trend around TA is an important seat at the table, and that's recognized. Like, it's not a support function, it is one of like the key and arguably like most important functions for your company. So I think just continuing to see that trajectory has been really wonderful, and I think that will only increase in coming years.
Yeah, will be as important as the CEO soon. Recruiting, it's going to be take over.
Pretty much. You got to hire and retain the right people. Like, what I think is so interesting is that like, TA is the most cross-functional department there is out there, right? Like, not only in that we work for hiring all the other for all the other departments, so you have to understand all the other departments, but then even when it comes to like, working with finance and comp, because you want to make sure that your comp bands are in line and that internal parity is there, to working with operations to figure out like where you're hiring, to working with marketing on branding, to like working really closely with like different parts of HR on what do growth frameworks look like for people inside the company, because you want to make sure you're selling that correctly to candidates and that you're finding the right candidate for the role based on what their objectives are and what their career growth could look like at the company. So it is fully all encompassing. So I think it's getting the credit it deserves given that.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that it's going to start becoming, I think, a much more desirable career path for people at a much earlier stage. You don't really. I still have never really met anyone who like dreamt of being a recruiter or tried to be a recruiter. They just kind of fell into it. But I think over the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to be interviewing recruiters who actually proactively tried to be recruiters or studied to be recruiters. And that's going to be an interesting shift. So.
No, I agree. Everyone I know has the I fell into it story, myself included, and it will be interesting to see that narrative.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be really fun. And I think it's just a testament to how important what we do is. So Sam, really Great speaking to you, and maybe we'll check in the year and see how it's been going at OneSignal. But great to chat.
Sounds great.
And speak soon.